Our featured guest tonight is an accomplished and well-respected bass player and vocalist whom has toured with some of the biggest and brightest stars in music. From David Lee Roth, Jeff Lynne, to Ringo Starr and Elton John, Matt Bissonette has worked with some of the best in the business. Here to chat about his life, career, and new album with his current band, the Redcoats, is musician Matt Bissonette. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I know music runs in your family, so what was your home like growing up, and what music surrounded you in your home?
Well, we grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and during the 60s was a pretty crazy time, everything going pretty crazy back there that time. It was my brother started playing drums when he was about 11, 12, and my mom and dad, they met in Michigan, and they're both musicians. My dad was a drummer, my mom played vibes, and they'd play on gigs together and stuff. So um, music was always around us, and my sister was always, we'd always be running around goofing off, with playing Beatles songs around the house and stuff like everybody was at the time. And my mom and dad, Gregg got going fast on the drums, and I was putting up a fight because I wanted to do sports. I didn't really like music as much, kind of the rebel in the house about not doing what everybody else was doing. And I would start going down into our basement and just playing my tennis racket, pretending it was a guitar, and just jamming out with the headphones, to any band, Beatles and even REO Speedwagon, who I'm playing with now, and Kansas and Rush and all these different bands, and just started feeling music a little bit. And then my mom and dad kind of surprised me one day. They're asking me, "Do you ever want to do this?" And I was like, "I don't know. I don't know if I see Gregg doing it, and he's." It's working out great for him. And Gregg would be running around the house at dinner time playing snare drum, his marching band snare drum while we're eating. It's like, you know, so I kind of putting up a fight about it. But one day, my mom said, "Go out and get the groceries out of the trunk." So I went out to pick them up, and there's this guitar in the case, So I'm going, and an amp inside the trunk. And they go, "Here you go." And I'm going, "Well, what's this?" And so you take it downstairs and set it up, and Gregg's ready to play because Gregg was in on it. He's got his drums set up, and we start jamming, and I'm thinking it's a guitar and it's a bass. So I'm going, okay, there's four strings, and this isn't like a guitar sound. What is this? And Gregg goes, "Well, look, you're not playing guitar. You're not playing like on Smoke in the Water. You're not going bam, bam, bam. You're the guy that's going dum, 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 dumb guy, dumb guy, dumb guy." And I'm going, "Well, what is that?" I didn't even really know what a bass was. So we sat in the basement and played that song, Smoke on the Water, for about 5 hours. And I kind of got it. I kind of was like, that's what this is, bass is pretty cool. And immediately my dad just started booking me with his band. He would play weddings two days a week. So within 2 weeks of having my bass, he bought me a tuxedo, and he goes, "Do you want to play? Do you want to make $50 a night?" I go, let's do this." I go, "Dad, I've told the story a million times, and sorry to repeat myself, but he'd go, I go, "Dad, I don't even know what I'm doing. What am I supposed to do?" Because we'd get there and I'd set up his drums and everything, and he'd be having a beer with his accordion player. So it'd be bass, drums, and accordion. I didn't know anything about music. And I go, "Dad, what am I supposed to do?" And he goes, and I'll never forget this, he just goes, "Just listen to Harry, the accordion player. Just watch him and pay attention and listen to him and listen to me and just feed off of what you hear. But the main thing and the most important thing is when we're on a break, if I point to you, go get me a beer from the bar." And that was my job. It was like, that was Detroit. You just go and you do it and you start working. So he had me working by the time I was probably 13 years old, playing twice a week with my tuxedo, every weekend. So in Detroit, you just get that work ethic and you just start making money. And I was making that money when I was that young, and my friends were all like, "Wow, you're rich." So it just kind of led into other things, playing with the band, the jazz band in school and high school band. And because the need for bass players in Detroit at the time, there wasn't a lot of them. So I got calls for playing in all the jazz bands, and we used to play for the Lions at Pontiac Silverdome with the uh, Brookside Jazz Band and Eddie Santini and all these different bands that were going on, is because of necessity. They didn't really have that many bass players. They were there, but everybody was working. So I kind of carved out a way in Detroit to work for a living and make a living. And then I went to North Texas State following my brother there. And then just decided I didn't really know for sure if music was what I wanted to do. In fact, when I got to college, I was in my third year and I was playing legit bass, which I wasn't very good at. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was kind of going, I don't really want to get a music ed degree because I don't know if I'd be a very good teacher. And I was just starting to get a little bit like, I don't really know what I want to do. And the third year of school, I was going to sign up for PE and try and be like a PE thing and still do music on the side. And then Maynard Ferguson called me to go on the road in my third year. And I've been on the road ever since then. It was just that call, like a lot of people that it happens to, it just changed everything. So I'm sitting here in a hotel room in Omaha, Nebraska, playing with REO because of that day.
Just a weird question. What kind of wedding set list incorporates an accordion?
Well, that's the funny thing is back in Detroit, man, Detroit is a tough town, like most of those towns back there. And at that time, I mean, you're talking 1973, 74, and rock and roll in Detroit is a big deal. Sometimes we'd be playing at a wedding for old people and we could play, we'd always start out with the standard set of like all the jazz tunes, all the things you are, and Left My Heart and Sam Frank's Disco and all that stuff, and play all those tunes, and it usually goes great. But sometimes we would be playing like Hell's Angels weddings and different weddings with a lot of bikers and stuff, and they would just get ticked off because we didn't have a guitar player. So we would play we'd play Smoke on the Water on the accordion, and my dad
Wah,
played
wah,
great.
wah, wah.
Right, exactly. That's what it was, and he laid his accordion on fire. But it sometimes would lead to really crazy things where they just were mad and they'd get really drunk and they would start, and there would always be a fight. The bride and the groom, more often than not, they'd get so drunk that by the last fourth set they'd start a fist fight. And I told people this before, that my dad and I had this situation where we'd always have my dad would make sure the first thing he'd do is get paid. Was once he got the money, he would be like, okay, this thing goes south, we're going to do the thing where I'm going to hand you the drums and you put them in the car and we're out of here. And my last gig I did with my dad, I remember there was a fight happening, and they were just, all these guys in tuxes, just beards and long hair, just beating the snot out of each other. And and I just remember my dad would go snare drum, and I'd put it in the car, hi-hat, and I would just go back and we'd look, we got everything ready to go. And he was walking out of the club, and I looked over his shoulder, and there was a lady hanging from a chandelier, just punching this guy in the face. And I was like, going, that was the last gig I ever did with my dad. And I was thinking about that yesterday for Father's Day. Like, what a weird life. But yeah, the tunes for accordion are kind of limited in the rock department.
Oh, speaking of your dad, I heard a story preparing for this interview that seems kind of like a great touchstone for a lot of things that came afterwards. And the story I'm thinking of is a Beatles concert in 1967. Your dad was able to take your brother and Gregg to. Now, before I was born, my parents saw the Beatles at Shea, and I understand it was just insane.
Yeah.
What is there a moment from the Beatles concert you saw in 1967 that has stuck with you for all these years? Because at some point later in the interview, we're going to have a full circle moment talking about your opportunity, your being able to play with Ringo Starr. Did that kind of trigger anything new or different in you, or was that just a cool thing you got to do with your dad?
Well, I mean, I'm sure everybody you interview is going to start with the Beatles got me into music. It's almost boring to say that now because it's the obvious. We were all absorbed in that. So my dad was playing at a club called the Rooster Tail in Detroit, and this guy and the Beatles, I think they were staying there or something on a day off. And he was like going, "What's going on with the Beatles?" And he goes, "Well, do you want tickets for the show?" And he goes, "Yeah, I'd love to get tickets." So he got a couple tickets, and he took Gregg and I think it was 1966, I believe, maybe 67. You might be right. But I remember driving in the car, getting out, and just mobs of people at Olympia Stadium in Detroit. And just the mayhem of the whole thing was just overwhelming. It was just all I really remember being that young was looking. I was on the right side and I was looking, and I couldn't hear anything they were playing because it was just so loud and crazy. But I remember cigarette lights, the lights of people's cigarettes, and just smoke and girls screaming. And the only thing I heard the whole night was when Paul sat down and played Yesterday. It got quiet for a second.
Quiet.
And then back to the Mayhem Crazy, and it was short and sweet and out of there. And we walked out of there just going, not even realizing what we just saw, you know.
It's crazy to me, and perhaps to you too, knowing what you and your brother would go on to do. I mean, imagine seeing the Beatles on stage, Ringo Starr playing drums, and out in the crowd are two young kids who, in 20 or 30 years, would go on to become some of the Ringo's future bandmates and players. I mean, what do you think about when you consider that?
Well, I'm just blown away with Greg and I always talk about how blessed we are to be able to play music with our heroes and people that we've never thought we would ever know. And moving into Los Angeles, you get more opportunities to meet these people, your heroes and people. And I was just talking to him the other day about when we were playing with Ringo. When you're around a Beatle, it's kind of weird because you don't want to ever say anything stupid, and everybody's super careful about what they say, but everybody's peppering Ringo with questions about what was it like for this, what was it like for that, and when I got in the band with Ringo and the Roundheads, and we were doing the DVD, a live DVD in Rockford, Illinois, 2002 or something like that. I never really wanted to approach him because I just didn't want to be a dork and just say anything stupid. So we were walking up on stage to play a show one day with Ringo, and behind the speakers, we're walking up, and it was like really they were playing Beatle music, and you couldn't really hear it. And Ringo looked at me, and I was like, "Okay, this is my obvious time for my question." And I go, "So when I saw you, and I couldn't, in '66, I couldn't hear anything. How did you ever hear when you're playing? How did you ever hear Paul, or how did you hear John? How did you hear the bass? I mean, I couldn't hear anything." And he looks at me, he goes, "Matt, I didn't hear anything of Paul. All I did was watch his ass." So he said he would just watch them move and play because he couldn't hear anything, you know? And I had an opportunity to do Ringo's song on his record last year, and it was at his house. And usually you're kind of in and out fast, but this time he sat there with me when I was recording the bass. He had already recorded the drums, and he wanted to sit there right next to me, and I'm thinking, okay. And he stayed the whole 45 minutes for the song. And in between takes, he was just talking. It was the first time I've ever had, we talked for like an hour. And it was almost like he said, "It's okay, Matt. You can ask me these questions that people want to ask." So I would just go, "So when you guys were doing this album and you were playing this," and he talked to me about it. And it was the first time I really picked his brain. And it was almost like he gave me Beatle permission, And it was just, I was just kind of pinching myself going, I'm like talking to him, and he was just a normal guy, and it was pretty cool. So that stuff, Greg and I always talk about how we meet people and we get to play in their bands or do sessions with them, and we're sitting there talking to them when we're two dorky guys from Detroit just growing up playing music, in the basement. It's just amazing. It's amazing the way life works.